Everybody knows the story now. The sharp suits, the flat caps with the razor blades sewn into the peak, the gang that ran a northern English city through fear and violence in the years after the First World War, immortalized in one of the most successful television dramas ever made. Peaky Blinders made Birmingham the most famous gangland in British history. But there is a secret hiding behind that story, and the people who made the drama have admitted it themselves. Because the real gang war, the one that was so vicious it earned an entire English city the nickname Little Chicago, the one that saw men slashed 100 times with razors in the street, houses besieged and stormed, a man beaten to death by a mob in front of his own family, and a squad of hand-picked police officers unleashed to fight terror with terror, did not happen in Birmingham at all. It happened 70 miles to the northeast, in a city the rest of Britain thought it knew, a city of steel, a city that made the finest knives and the strongest armor plate in the world, that armed the Royal Navy and put stainless cutlery on every table in the land. A city so respectable, so proud of its craftsmanship and its honest hard work, that nobody outside it wanted to believe what was happening in its slums. For 3 years, from 1923 to 1925, Sheffield, the steel city, was ruled not by its factory owners, or its council, or its ancient guild of master craftsmen, but by 2 rival gangs, fighting a war so brutal, so relentless, that the government in London finally ordered the police to break it by any means necessary, lawful or not. This is the story the makers of Peaky Blinders quietly borrowed from. This is the real gang war in the real city that Britain spent a century forgetting. It is a story of razor blades and pitch-and-toss rings, of a hilltop worth a fortune, of a crime lord called the Generalissimo, and a policeman who would go on to run MI5, and of an entire community held hostage in the shadow of the furnaces. And underneath it all lies a darker and sadder truth about how this city rose, and how it was one day left to fall. How does one of the great workshops of the world, a city famous across 6 centuries for making the sharpest blades on earth, end up turning those blades on itself? This is the rise and fall of Sheffield. To understand how a city of proud craftsmen became a war zone, you first have to understand the city and the strange, brilliant, brutal thing it had spent 600 years becoming. Because the violence of the 1920s did not come from nowhere. It grew out of the exact same soil that had made Sheffield rich, and to see how, you have to go all the way back to the blade. Sheffield has been making cutting edges for longer than almost anywhere in England has been making anything. As far back as the 14th century, its knives were already famous. When Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales in the 1380s, he could describe a character carrying a Sheffield whittle, a Sheffield blade, and simply trust that every reader in England would understand exactly what that meant, a weapon from Sheffield. The city sat where several fast rivers came tumbling down off the Pennine Hills, giving it water power to turn the grindstones, and it had millstone grit in those hills to make the grindstones themselves, and iron and coal close by. It was, like Merthyr and Newcastle, a place assembled by geology for one purpose. In Sheffield's case, that purpose was steel. For centuries it was a town of small workshops, of self-employed master craftsmen, the city called the Little Mesters, men of extraordinary, narrow brilliance, who each did one thing, one stage of the making of a knife, and did it better than anyone alive. A single pocket knife might pass through a dozen pairs of specialist hands, the forger, the grinder, the hardener, the cutler who assembled it, the buffer who finished it. And then, in 1742, a clockmaker named Benjamin Huntsman, looking for a better steel for his springs, invented a process the world had been waiting for, crucible steel, a way of melting steel to a purity and toughness nobody had achieved before, cast in clay pots in furnaces across the town. It changed everything. In the century that followed, Sheffield's annual steel production rose from around 200 tons to 80,000, until this one city was making very nearly half of all the steel in Europe. And then, in the 1850s, Henry Bessemer brought his revolutionary converter to Sheffield, a towering vessel that could blast air through molten iron and turn out cheap steel by the ton, and the town exploded into a city. The Bessemer boom sent Sheffield steel across the entire planet. By 1871, the United States of America was importing over 3 times as much railway track from Sheffield as it made in the whole of its own country. The population, which had been around 14,000 in the 1730s, climbed past 135,000 by 1851 and kept climbing, 500,000 and more, as the east end of the city filled with melting shops and rolling mills, and the great works of names like Firth and Vickers and Camel. The whole eastern half of the city became a single roaring engine of fire and steel, the sky above it glowing red through the night, the air thick with smoke you could taste. A place a visitor once said looked less like a city than like a vast workshop that had swallowed one whole. And Sheffield did not just make more steel, it made better steel than anyone on earth. In 1913, a metallurgist at a Sheffield laboratory named Harry Brearley, trying to find a metal that would resist the erosion inside gun barrels, added chromium to his mix, cast a test piece, and threw it on the scrap heap when it failed his particular test. Weeks later, he noticed that, unlike every other offcut rusting around it, that one piece was still bright. It would not rust, it would not even stain. He had invented stainless steel, in Sheffield, almost by accident, and within a few years, the city that had always made the world's blades was making the world's knives and forks as well, gleaming, rustless, and stamped with the 2 words that were a guarantee of quality in every corner of the empire: made in Sheffield. This was the city at its height, and you have to hold the whole of it in your mind, because it contained 2 completely different worlds stacked on top of one another. There was the Sheffield of the Cutlers' Hall and the Company of Cutlers, the ancient guild that had governed the trade since 1624, a city of master craftsmen and wealthy steel magnates, and genuine, world-beating genius, of grand civic buildings, and a proud, respectable, hard-working identity that the whole nation admired. This was the Sheffield that thought of itself as the honest workshop of the world, where a man's skill was everything, and the 2 words stamped on a blade meant it was the finest that could be made. And directly beneath it, in the tight streets of the East End and the district known simply as the Park, there was the other Sheffield, the Sheffield of the slums. The 2 were not miles apart. They were stacked on top of each other, the grand works and the desperate courts, the wealth and the want, separated by nothing more than a street, because the wealth of the steel city was built on the bodies of the men who made it, and their lives were short and hard and dangerous. The grinders in particular died young, hunched over their spinning stones in clouds of steel and stone dust that destroyed their lungs, a disease so common and so certain that it had its own name, grinders' asthma, and the men who suffered it rarely saw 50. The great works could take on or throw out thousands of men on the swing of a trade cycle, so that a family might be comfortable one month and starving the next through no fault of its own. And in the crowded, smoke-blackened courts and back-to-back houses of the Park District, life was lived on the very edge of survival, in the perpetual shadow of the furnaces, on wages that vanished the moment the order books thinned. This was a population that knew hardship intimately, that had learned not to trust the good times, and that had every reason to look for an escape, or an edge, wherever it could be found. And in those slums, in the shadow of the greatest steel city in the world, one thing offered the working man a flash of hope, of excitement, of the possibility of turning a single shilling into a week's wages in an afternoon: gambling. And it was around gambling, and the fortunes to be made from controlling it, that the darkness gathered. It centered on a game called pitch and toss. The rules could not have been simpler. A man tossed 3 coins into the air, and you bet on how they would land, heads or tails. It needed no equipment, no cards, no board, nothing that had to be set up or hidden away. Just 3 coins and a patch of open ground, which made it perfect, because street gambling was illegal, and a game with no equipment could scatter in seconds when the police appeared. Hundreds of men would gather to play, and the biggest, best organized pitching site in the whole city was on a ridge of open wasteland high above the park slums, a place called Sky Edge. Sky Edge was perfect, and whoever controlled it controlled a fortune. Its position on the hilltop meant lookouts could spot police coming from a long way off, giving the gamblers time to melt away, and that security drew the biggest spending gamblers from right across Sheffield and beyond. Hundreds of pounds changed hands there on a good day, and the men who ran the ring took a cut, a toll, of every single bet. On Sky Edge, the toll was around 20%. Whoever held that hilltop held one of the most lucrative illegal enterprises in the north of England, and by 1919, it was held by a man named George Mooney. George Mooney was, by the accounts of the time, the closest thing Sheffield had to a crime lord, described by one writer as the generalissimo of Sheffield crime. His gang, the Mooney Gang, controlled Sky Edge and ran protection rackets across the east end of the city. Publicans paid them to prevent breakages. Gang members waited outside the factory gates on payday to take a cut of the workers' wages and rode home afterwards in taxis the drivers knew better than to charge for. For a few years after the war, Mooney's operation ran smoothly, in loose alliance with another group of hard men from the Park District, led by a professional criminal named Sam Garvin, a man with a string of convictions going back to 1904 and, crucially, connections that reached up into local politics. And then the money began to run out, and everything fell apart. The thing that lit the fuse was the very thing that had made Sheffield great. The First World War had brought a colossal boom to the Steel City, the works running around the clock, making munitions and armor, wages higher than they had ever been, full employment, and money to burn on Sky Edge. But when the war ended, the munitions contracts ended with it. By the beginning of 1920, the munitions works were closing, and unemployment tore through the city. By 1921, there were estimated to be nearly 70,000 jobless men in Sheffield. By 1925, over 25,000 were still out of work in a city that, 8 years earlier, had known full employment. With the workers broke, there was less and less money to gamble, and the gang's profits collapsed. And when there is not enough to go round, allies become enemies. In 1923, George Mooney made his move. He decided to cut his old Park District associates out of the business to keep a bigger share of the shrinking pot for himself, laying off the very men who had helped him hold Sky Edge. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The men he cast aside did not disappear. They unified under Sam Garvin, took the name the Park Brigade, and declared war. What followed was 2 years of a savagery that genuinely shocked a nation that thought it had seen everything in the trenches. It was not organized crime as we might picture it, not sophisticated, not hidden. It was a running street war between two mobs who knew each other intimately, who had drunk together and worked together, and now hated each other with the special ferocity of former friends, and it earned Sheffield the name that stuck to it for a century: Little Chicago. The comparison was to the America of Al Capone, of Prohibition gangsters shooting it out in the streets, and for the people of the Park District, it did not feel like an exaggeration at all. It began, as these things do, with a single blow. One night in April 1923, Mooney's gang tried to strike first, breaking into the home of a Park Brigade man named Bill Furness and beating him savagely with hammers as he lay in his bed. Furness survived, and he did not go to the police. He wanted revenge, not justice, and in the world of these gangs, that was simply how things were settled. 2 days later, a member of the Park Brigade, Frank Kidnew, was caught leaving a tossing game, and he was slashed with razors over 100 times. He survived that too, somehow, and the detail that has come down through the years tells you everything about the men involved. When they got him to hospital, bleeding from 100 wounds, he was reportedly more concerned about his ruined suit than his ruined body. To be marked by the razor was almost a badge of the life. To lose your good suit was an insult, and so it went, back and forth, month after month, for 2 years, tit-for-tat attacks, ambushes outside pubs, razor slashings in the dark, beatings with pokers and hammers, stabbings with bayonets that men had carried home from the Western Front. Homes were besieged and stormed in the night. When the Park Brigade came in force to break into George Mooney's own house, his family fought them off through the windows with a shotgun and a rifle, and one of the attackers was shot in the shoulder and carried away bleeding. When the police searched the Mooney house afterwards and found the shotgun, the rifle, a revolver, and ammunition, the great crime lord of Sheffield was fined the grand sum of £10 and allowed to walk free. And that, more than anything else, is why the war was able to rage on so long. The violence was terrifying, but the consequences were trivial. The gangs ruled by fear, and fear worked. Witnesses were too frightened to testify or too bound by the code of the slums to inform, so case after case collapsed for want of evidence. And on the rare occasions when a conviction was secured, the courts handed down sentences so light, a few weeks here, a small fine there, that they deterred absolutely nobody. The men of the special duty squad that would eventually be formed came to believe the magistrates were as much a part of the problem as the gangs, and so, for 2 long years, no street, no pub, no home in the entire East End of Sheffield was truly safe. The 2 gangs were described at the time as Sheffield's own Montagues and Capulets, except that instead of fair Verona, their war was fought in the smoke and the back courts and the tossing rings of Little Chicago, and the ordinary families caught in the middle simply had to endure it. And then, in the spring of 1925, it went too far, and the killing that ended the gangs was the killing of a man who was barely part of them at all. His name was William Plummer. He was, by most accounts, an ordinary working man, a former soldier, only incidentally caught up in the gang world, who had made the mistake of getting into a fight with a member of one of the gangs, and, worse, of winning it. On the night of the 27th of April 1925, a group of men came for him outside his home. Plummer was set upon by a mob and beaten and stabbed to death in the street, in front of his own family. It was never entirely established who struck the fatal blow, but in the trial that followed, 2 brothers, Wensley and Lawrence Fowler, were convicted of the murder, and both were hanged. The murder of an innocent man in front of his family, and the hangings that followed, was the turning point. The public outcry was enormous, and it reached London, and the response, when it came, was as ruthless as the gangs themselves. If the story of Britain's forgotten places means something to you, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it is one of the few things that keeps a place like this from being forgotten twice. This channel brings the lost history of Britain's great towns and cities back to life, the places that built the modern world and were then quietly left behind by it. Now, back to Sheffield, and to the men sent in to end the war. Just 4 days after Plummer was killed, the Chief Constable of Sheffield formed something new. A special duty squad, quickly nicknamed the Flying Squad, made up of a handful of hand-picked police officers chosen for one qualification above all others: size. They were the biggest, hardest men the force could find, taken out of uniform, put into plain clothes, and given a deliberately vague and aggressive remit to go out onto the streets, seek out the known gang members wherever they gathered, and deal with them. And deal with them they did, in a manner that would be a national scandal today. The squad fought the gangs with the gang's own weapons and the gang's own methods. They sought out gangsters and beat them, in the pubs, in the yards, in the street, wherever they found them, on the reasoning that men who ruled by fear could only be broken by a greater fear. One of the most famous confrontations took place in a pub called the Red House, a brawl that has passed into Sheffield legend. The tactics were brutal, confrontational, and completely outside anything we would now recognize as lawful policing. There was no arrest, no charge, no court in much of it. There was simply a very large policeman and a very hard fist. And, on its own terms, it worked. In 1926, a new chief constable arrived to finish the job, a man whose name would become legendary far beyond Sheffield: Percy Sillitoe. Sillitoe had learned his policing in the brutal world of colonial South Africa, and he arrived with absolutely no scruples about meeting violence with greater violence. and a genius for organizing it. Under Sillitoe, the squad's campaign of state-sanctioned beatings was refined and intensified, the leaders targeted and jailed, the gangs hunted until they were, quite simply, smashed. Their power was broken. Their reign over the East End ended not in a courtroom, but in a series of beatings in the dark. By 1928, the Special Duty Squad was disbanded because there was no longer any work for it to do. Sheffield's gang war was over, and the city, which had lived in fear for the better part of 3 years, finally exhaled. Percy Sillitoe went on to become one of the most celebrated policemen in British history, and his career is a story in itself. He took his gang-busting methods north to Glasgow, where he broke the notorious razor gangs of that city in exactly the same ruthless way, and he ended his career at the very top of the British establishment as the Director General of MI5, the head of the Secret Service, where he helped expose the Cambridge spy ring and the atom spies who had passed nuclear secrets to the Soviets. The man who made his name in the slums and tossing rings of Sheffield died a knight of the realm. It is one of the stranger journeys in British public life, and it began here, in Little Chicago. So what is the honest verdict on Sheffield's secret war? Here we have to be careful, because it is a story that has been sensationalized for a century, and the truth deserves better than the myth. It would be dishonest not to say that Sheffield was, by the standards of the great cities, a relatively small and contained gang war. Historians are careful to point out that other places, London above all, saw more widespread, more organized, and more sophisticated criminal violence over far longer periods. The Sheffield gangs were not a mafia. They built no lasting criminal empire, controlled no politicians from the shadows in any grand sense, ran no operation that outlived them by more than a few years. They were, at bottom, groups of hard, poor, desperate men fighting over the takings of an illegal coin-tossing game on a patch of hilltop wasteland. The Little Chicago nickname flattered them, borrowing the glamour of Al Capone for a war that was really about a few pounds a day, and the drama of the story has grown considerably in the century of retelling since. But set against that, two things are absolutely true, and they matter. The first is that for the people of the Park and the East End, this was not a colourful story at all. It was 2 years of genuine terror, of not being safe in your own street or your own bed, of a working-class community held hostage by violent men and failed, for a long time, by a legal system that would not protect them. The romance of the gangster is always a lie told by people who did not have to live next door to him. And the second truth is the one that connects Sheffield to the story the whole world now knows. Because when the writer of Peaky Blinders, drawing on the work of the historian Carl Chin, went looking for the real gangland of 1920s England, the vicious gang wars of Sheffield were a central part of what he found. Chin, himself the great-grandson of a real Birmingham Peaky Blinder, has written plainly about the ferocious war between the Mooney gang and the Park Brigade, and it fed directly into the world the drama built. The world remembers Birmingham and the sharp-suited Shelby family and the flat caps with the razors sewn into the peak. But the razor slashings, the illegal pitch and toss rings on the hilltops, the toll taken on every bet, the war between two rival gangs so savage it earned a city the name Little Chicago. All of that was Sheffield, first and for real. The most famous gangland story in modern Britain is, in very large part, a Sheffield story wearing a Birmingham coat. And here is the final, quiet irony, because Sheffield's real tragedy was not the gangs at all. The gangs were a symptom. The disease was what happened to the steel. The whole convulsion of the 1920s had been triggered by the collapse of the wartime steel boom, the sudden mass unemployment when the munitions work ended, and 70,000 men were thrown out of work. The war between Mooney and Garvin was, at bottom, a fight over the shrinking scraps of a city whose main industry had just contracted violently. And that pattern, the terrible dependence on a single trade that the wider world controlled, boom and then brutal bust, was the real, deeper story of Sheffield, and it had a final act still to come, decades later, that would make the gang wars look like a footnote. For a long time it did not come. The steel and the cutlery went on. Sheffield armed the nation again through the Second World War, making the shells and the armour and the special steels the war machine demanded, and it was bombed heavily for its trouble, the German raiders coming for the works and hitting the city centre and the housing instead, killing hundreds in the Sheffield Blitz of December 1940. It came through and rebuilt, and for a generation after the war, the furnaces still burned, and a boy leaving school could still walk into the works his father knew. The two words, "Made in Sheffield," still meant something in every kitchen in the country. But the same forces that had hollowed out Merthyr and silenced the Tyne were coming for the Steel City too, and when they arrived fast. Foreign steel, made more cheaply in more modern plants abroad, undercut Sheffield in market after market. The old works, many of them cramped and aging, could not compete on price. And then, in the 1980s, came the same brutal political reckoning with heavy industry that tore the heart out of the coalfields, and Sheffield, a city of steel and of miners on its doorstep, was hit from both sides at once. Just up the road, at Orgreave, in 1984, the miners' strike produced one of the most violent confrontations in modern British history. Thousands of pickets and police fighting on a field on the city's edge. In the space of just a few years in the 1980s, the bulk of Sheffield's steel industry was destroyed. The great works that had employed tens of thousands of men, that had made the city one of the wonders of the industrial world, closed one after another and were pulled down. The east end of Sheffield, once a 5-mile wall of furnaces and rolling mills that turned the night sky orange and could be heard across the whole valley, fell silent and dark and empty. The city that had made half the steel in Europe, that had armed the Royal Navy, invented stainless steel, and put its name on the cutlery in homes across the world, watched its entire reason for being dismantled in less than a decade. Tens of thousands of jobs vanished. The unemployment and the poverty that followed settled over whole districts and did not lift for a generation. The blades that Chaucer had written about in the 14th century, that had made the city's name across 600 years of history, were now, for the most part, made somewhere else entirely. It was, in the end, the same story that this channel keeps finding in city after British city. A place builds itself, brilliantly, around one great industry. It rides that industry to the very top of the world. And then the world changes, or decides it no longer needs what the city makes, and the city is left stranded with its skills, its pride, and its people, and nothing to do with any of them. The gangs of Little Chicago had fought and died over the scraps of one downturn. The real collapse, when it came 60 years later, took the whole thing. And yet, this is not quite where it ends, because Sheffield, like all these cities, is a stubborn place, and it did not simply lie down and disappear. Stand in Sheffield now, and the steel has not entirely gone. It survives in a smaller, cleverer, quieter form, in specialist and high-tech alloys, in the aerospace and advanced manufacturing research parks on the edge of the city, where Sheffield engineers still make some of the most sophisticated metal in the world, if far fewer hands are needed to make it now. The knowledge did not die. Only the vast army of men who once carried it did. On the acres of wasteland where the great works stood along the valley floor, there is now a shopping complex and an arena and retail sheds, and a visitor would never guess that this flat, ordinary ground was once the roaring furnace heart of the industrial world. The slums of the Park District, where the gangs fought and bled, were swept away in the 1960s and replaced by Park Hill, a vast, brutal, ambitious estate of concrete flats, built right across the hillside, on the very ground where the tossing ring had been. Park Hill is a listed building now, controversial, half-hated and half-loved, being slowly and expensively restored, and it stands on the skyline above the city, exactly where Sky Edge overlooked the slums. You can go up there, to the hilltop where George Mooney's lookouts once watched for the approach of the police, and look out over the whole of Sheffield spread in its bowl of hills, and there is nothing left of the tossing ring, or the gangs, or the terror at all. And the memory of the war has been reclaimed rather than buried. The Sheffield gang wars have become the subject of a much reprinted book and a BBC documentary, and the city has slowly come to understand that the gangland story the whole world fell in love with on television was, in its bones, partly its own, that the Steel City had lived the reality decades before Birmingham wore it as costume. But when Sheffield finally chose, in the modern age, who from its hard history it actually wanted to honour with a monument, it did not choose the gangsters at all. In 2016, it raised a statue in the city centre to the women of steel, the women who had taken over the furnaces and the rolling mills through 2 world wars while the men were away fighting, and who had never been properly thanked. Faced with a century of steel and slums and violence, the city chose to remember the workers. Stand up on that hilltop at Sky Edge now, on a grey Yorkshire evening, with the concrete decks of Park Hill behind you, and the whole city laid out below where the furnaces used to burn red against the clouds, and it is quiet. The tossing ring is 100 years gone, the gangs are dust, Mooney and Garvin, and the razor men, and the huge policemen who beat them off the streets, are all long dead, and the great works that made the terror and the wealth alike have mostly vanished from the valley floor. Sheffield made the sharpest blades in the world for 600 years. It armed the world, and it fed the world, and it dressed the world's tables in gleaming rustless steel. And for 2 violent years, in the shadow of those same furnaces, it turned its blades upon itself. In a war so brutal, it borrowed the name of Chicago, and, in the end, quietly lent its soul to a story the whole world would tell about somewhere else. And almost nobody, beyond the 7 hills of the city itself, ever knew that any of it happened here at all. If you have walked with this story all the way to the end, then you already know this channel is for you. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. We uncover a different lost British town or city every week, and there are far more of them than you would ever think. The next one is waiting for you on screen right now.